Okay, so a few months back I got into an argument with someone. I don't want to reveal too much, they know who they are, and this video isn't really about them or that argument, but rather it's about something they said in that argument. For context, the person in question was asserting how a miscommunication couldn't be their fault, and as part of their reasons for why, asserted that they were an excellent communicator. Famously something good communicators feel the need to say, citing several reasons they believed this. One of which was a claim I would like to explore with you today. Quote, I have tested my vocabulary several times on the request of English learning friends and found it to be consistently around 30,000 words, which is quite large for my age. To many in my audience, who come here for reasons a bit more eldritch than this, I'm working on it, I promise. This might not sound all that crazy to assert. Sure, it's a bit of a rude way to say it, and dare I say, childish. But plenty of people know a lot of words, so if this person is one of them, and they've had their vocabulary tested, what's the big deal? Well, viewer, you see, it's not that there's a problem with the idea of someone knowing a lot of words. The problem is that the assertion itself doesn't make sense. So let's look into this idea today and ask the question, how many words does the average adult actually know? If you were curious and decided to search how many words the average adult knows, you're almost certainly going to get a mix of answers. Some sources give numbers as low as 10,000, some say more than 40,000, some say 20, some say 30. At least one source, according to Bill Bryson's The Mother Tongue, said 250,000. To the uninformed layman, this must seem like quite a lot of variation for what shouldn't be that tricky of a question. I mean, how hard is it to just measure the number of words someone knows? Surely you can just count. It might take a while, but lots of research takes a while to complete. Well, dear viewer, lucky for you, you have access to me, your informed guide, ready to answer your questions and tell you the unfortunate fact that yes, it actually is that complicated. In fact, it's so complicated that I feel confident in asserting that any attempt to find an answer will, invariably, be wrong, and that you'd be better off picking a random number from 1 to 100,000 to figure out how many words you know, than to rely on tests claiming to give you an answer. And to know why, we only need to ask one simple question. So simple, in fact, that the greatest minds in all of linguistics have never found an answer. What is a word? Addie, sweet, dear, lovable Addie, we, thy patient viewers, know and accept that thou art insane. But by now, we have grown used to thy burgeoning insanity, and know that thou posest no threat neither to thyself nor to others. But this is just one more example of thy occasionally worrying disconnect from reality. Hast thou forgotten what a word is? It's a simple question to answer, so simple, in fact, that even a child could answer it. Surely, if that's the case, the greatest minds in all thy chosen field should view it not as some fearsome puzzle which few dare to even attempt, but as a topic unworthy even of discussion, debate, or deliberation. Surely, this must be the case, for we have books full of lists of words. And even software from the 90s had no issue counting words. Now please, progress, but return to some semblance of normalcy and leave this insanity behind. Oh, patient and merciful viewer, I am humbled beyond words. Your stroke of genius has revolutionized linguistics. For if it is the case that we've had this fantastical technology since the 90s, I should investigate it immediately. Now, viewer, you see here a modern word processor, which surely must be even better than the technology available in the 90s. Brilliant, a machine that counts words. This revolutionizes everything. Let's experiment. Wait, hang on. Are we already done? I guess B is a word. Fascinating. I would have never guessed that numerals were also words. There's way more to words than I ever thought there were. With this new technology at our disposal, we're going to revolutionize the field. Wait a minute here, viewer. The character underscore is also a word? I wonder if other symbols are words. Fascinating. I wonder what the origin of left arrow is. Hang on. Let me check something. That is interesting. I may not be fluent in Japanese by any means, but I have it on good authority that there are at least 2 words in the sentence, watashi wa gengo gakusha desu. Viewer, you should well know by this point that my ever-progressing insanity does not affect my capacity for linguistics, merely my ability to interact with those of sound mind. And I think now that I've made my point, it should be clear that what we previously thought a trivial task might now seem to be a bit more complicated than you initially expected. Let's return to those examples we just saw. Apple is certainly a word. I hope we all agree on that. But the letter B isn't, and these are just funny symbols. And this is a whole sentence in Japanese. Google Docs is clearly just using spaces, so it would seem that we can't rely on technology to solve this problem. But that said, we definitely know what a word is when we see it, right? Let's start with a simple example. What about the verb walk? That's certainly a word. I don't think anyone is disputing that, but what if I conjugate it? Is the walk in the sentence, I walked to the store, a different word from the walks in he walks home? What about walked? Like in I walked around town. Are those different words? Part of the problem with coming up with a consistent definition of a word is that things we often label as words are prone to changing form, which really complicates the question. Like, are dog and dogs different words? Or are they just the same word with 2 different realizations dependent on number? Are different forms of the same verb different words, or are they just different realizations of the same underlying form with subject or tense agreement tacked on? It certainly doesn't seem right to say that they're completely different words, and if we're trying to count how many words a person knows, does it really seem right to count plural forms or conjugations as distinct words? I mean, it pretty much comes down to adding an S or an ED to the end. Like, should my vocabulary really double because I know how to make a plural? Conversely, what about irregular plurals? How many words do those count as? If you think dog and dogs are the same word, are cactus and cacti? If you think they're different, what about sheep and sheep? If we look at verbs, what about be and go, which become was and went in the past? I mean, those are definitely more different than something like walk and walked. This is just the first of many barriers to answering the question of what counts as a word, and while I assume that some people will have hard opinions about the last few, things only get vaguer and more confusing from here. Before we continue, let's address the leather-bound first edition copy of the unabridged OED in the room. Earlier, dear viewer, you appealed to the existence of books with lists of words in them. Dictionaries, I believe they're called. For those unfamiliar, they list words in a consistent but arbitrary order. You might suggest that each dictionary entry is its own word, and I think that's a reasonable proposal, but it falls apart pretty quickly. Usually when you see the verb assume, it means something like guess, but it can also mean lay claim to or seize. Does that mean that the verb assume is actually at least 2 different words? Is it one word with multiple meanings? Neither answer makes me really all that happy, and I bet they don't make you all that happy either. I'm willing to accept that homophones are separate words, especially when they're spelled differently, but sometimes a word just has multiple meanings, and that's a bit more of a fuzzy case. Assuming that you're paying attention, you should already be seeing where we're going with this, but don't get ahead of me just yet. Earlier, I brought up the verb walk. But there's this other word that's pronounced the same, but with a different part of speech. So is walk the verb a different word from walk the noun? Like in the sentence, I went on a walk. I guess I would be willing to allow them to be different words, but it feels a bit cheap to say that. Like, if a word can have multiple meanings, is it not possible for one underlying word to have multiple parts of speech? Especially because they're clearly related and have very similar meanings. Actually, that brings something to mind. I've recently been reading some books about dictionaries and the history of English, and one of the things I don't think people realize is just how laborious the process of actually writing a dictionary can be. The first edition of the OED took literally 70 years to finish. There's a lot of reasons for why that is, but one of them is that sometimes words have only one meaning. Sometimes they have a few unrelated meanings, which, if they're unrelated and you feel that makes them separate words, I'd certainly be willing to accept that. But sometimes this thing called polysemy happens, and words take on multiple different but clearly related meanings, and that complicates things quite a lot. This happens a lot with really simple words. As best I can tell, when the next edition of the OED comes out in 2037, the word with the longest definition will likely be run, which will supposedly have, I'm not joking here, 645 definitions for the verb alone. Almost all of these definitions will likely be pretty closely related. Sure, there's the obvious use, meaning to go faster than a walk, but there's also to contend in a race, which clearly comes from the first definition. To move or flow, like in the stream runs downhill. To cause something to move or flow, like in run a bath. To happen consistently, like in it runs in my family. To encounter, like in run into someone. To be fueled by, like in runs on gas. And to function, like in is your refrigerator running? All of these meanings are clearly related, but also clearly different. So that begs the question, are they separate words? I genuinely do not know the answer. Run isn't even the only English verb to have that issue. In fact, the previous word with the longest definition was set, which has such a long definition that the unabridged version of the OED devotes 60,000 words to defining it. To set the record straight, that makes it just under 3 times the length of the 2006 literary classic My Immortal, while having none of the cultural significance. And were it an audiobook, it would be about 72.5 times as long as Belgian techno anthem, Pump Up the Jam. Another small word with big ambitions is get, which is apparently hell for lexicographers assigned to it because it gets repurposed to do a ton of grammatical stuff. Sure, you may say it means to acquire, but what if I say, I get it now? Does it still mean that? Or what about in the sentence, get over it? What if you get hurt, or only got a few hours of sleep, or got what was coming to you? What if I told you to...
Get in, loser, we're going shopping.
Like with run, those all definitely sorta kinda feel related, but I can't quite put my finger on how exactly they are. Let's get back to that one in a little bit, though. Contractions also kind of pose a problem for what a word is. Like, there's these words floating around, but everyone understands that they're made of 2 other words that have been grafted together. So is it's a word? What about words like shoulda, coulda, and woulda? We all know that those are just shorter ways of saying should have, could have, and would have. So are they the same words or different words? Or something in between? And since we're talking about contractions, let's ask the question about compound words in general. Is dark blue a word? I think it feels more like 2 words than 1, personally, but I'd be sympathetic to an alternative analysis. What about numbers like 1,000 or 45? We checked numerals earlier, but when spoken aloud, I certainly feel like they're closer to a single word than not. Before we get into the final sort of big problem with just the issue of attempting to even figure out what a word is, I have what might wind up being the most divisive question out of this list. Are the names of people, places, products, and porganizations words? It might sound silly, but remember that our goal here is to count how many words an adult knows, so if personal names count as words, that could absolutely mess with our numbers. If you think names are words, do names with different spellings count as different words? I personally say no, but I know people who are very opinionated on that fact. What about places? I live near the city of San Francisco. Is that a word? Is it 2 words? Is it somewhere in between? The same issues can be raised for brand names, trademarks, and the names of various organizations or products. Are the names of companies words? If you said no, please direct your attention to the following song.
You call it Velcro, but we're begging you. This is f***ing hook and loop.
Is Velcro a word? Those lawyers seem to have a problem with people using it as one. What about Kleenex, rollerblade, Google? Is Google the verb different from Google the company? Is Google the company different from Google the search engine? What about Google the number, of which Google is a misspelling? I have no answers here. I have my gut instincts on some of these, but no matter what answers I come up with, I'm not happy with them. Finally, to round off the question of what even is a word, how many words is a word? Again, I'm completely serious here. Words tend to get complicated when we discuss them in context, and sometimes words do this thing where they blur into each other at a distance. The easiest examples of these are idioms, which are phrases that contain things that certainly look like words, but where the ultimate meaning doesn't come from the bits inside. We all understand that spill the beans means to reveal a secret, but there's nothing in the sentence she spilled the beans that actually lets you know that she failed to keep a secret. In a way, idioms are kind of like big words with spaces in them, and before you start asserting that words can't contain spaces, why not? It's a serious question. Why can't they? You might suggest that English words can't contain spaces, but that hardly seems like some immutable law of the universe, especially given that English, like other Germanic languages, really does love doing stuff with prepositions and periphrasis. This is the German verb ausgehen, to go out. This is the German verb ausgehen used in a sentence. Notice how it magically disassembled and became two separate words? Is it one word? Or is it two? I know we're primarily dealing with English here, but that example should show you why you might want to be open to the idea of a word being multiple words long. Infinitives in English, for example, all make use of the preposition to as part of their formation. This preposition is an integral part of the verb. English grammar demands that it be present for infinitive verbs. There's also the whole class of prepositional verbs in English, which are very much different in meaning than just a normal verb plus a preposition. Consider the verb to put and compare it with the verb to put up with. This is a similar problem to the idiom issue. In order for the verb to work, you absolutely need all the pieces. Removing either the up or the with completely changes the meaning, so how many words is to put up with? I would argue that it is, at the absolute most, 4. But I don't feel like 4 is the correct number for the word here, especially since our goal is to figure out how many words someone knows. Does knowledge of an idiom or verb like this count as knowing a separate word to the base components? I feel like it should. This is probably good enough to drive home the point that creating a clear and consistent definition for what a word is struggles with even one language, and creating one that works in a consistent way across languages is effectively impossible. But be warned, the topic does not stop here, especially if you want to try to create a definition that satisfies the needs of multiple languages. So now that we've addressed why you can't really create a universally effective or agreed upon definition for what a word is, we should ask the next most important question in figuring out how many words the average adult knows. What counts as knowing a word? Let's imagine for a moment that we had a magical device granted to us by whatever higher power you choose to believe, which allowed us to objectively identify words and distinguish them from non-words. Even if this objective wordometer, patent pending, were real, building the test would still be an incredibly difficult feat, and would likely only be slightly easier than figuring out what a word is. By this point, it shouldn't be that hard to figure out that knowing what a word is will be a difficult question to answer. And you may already have guessed as to why. The first issue is that there are two types of vocabulary, active and passive. Active vocabulary is the words you actually use in your day-to-day life, while passive vocabulary is the words you don't really use but could recognize or understand if you saw them. Your active vocabulary is going to be much smaller than your passive vocabulary. Most people don't actually use that many words in their day-to-day life, and I'd be willing to bet money that the average person uses fewer than 3,000 unique words in a day. Hell, the average person may not get above 5,000 unique words in a year. Though, don't quote me on that. So before we can design our test, we need to ask if we're attempting to count passive or active vocabulary. If we choose to test for active vocabulary, congratulations! We're going to need a representative sample of English-speaking adults, approval from the ethics committee, and a horde of willing graduate students that we can use to count every distinct word in the hundreds of hours of recordings we're about to get. And before you think that this is going to be a walk in the park, which is what you and I will be doing while the grad students count unique tokens, we're likely going to want to get a month of recordings per person to make sure that we don't miss the extra rare, shiny words. Could we do with less? Theoretically. But active vocabulary is going to be the least diverse. Most of the things people say are stuff like and one Diet Coke easy on the ice. Hardly the most interesting or worthwhile things to look out for. What we really want to look out for is how many uncommon words they're using. I mean, think about it. Sure, most kids know what an aquarium is, but when was the last time you actually said that word out loud? When was the last time you said anything with more than 3 syllables out loud? Sure, you probably say a few different 4 or 5 syllable words in a day, but the question is how many? Those are the words that will be pushing you above a vocabulary of 2,000. The reason we have to do this check for active vocabulary is because there really isn't any other way to count how many words people use. If text-to-speech were more reliable and could track what only one person said, we could maybe do something with that? But we haven't even decided if active vocabulary is what we really want to track, so it doesn't exactly do much for us. Now, if we want to track passive vocabulary, which is probably what you actually care about, things get a bit more challenging. I think the most straightforward solution is to take everything that the objective wordometer determined was a word, put them into a random order, and then have a random sample of people mark every word in the list that they do or do not know. Oh, wait, I'm being informed that this is actually torture in 47 different countries and is known to the state of California to cause cancer, so probably not the best idea to have a bunch of adults read lists of thousands of words to see how many they actually know. The issue with this methodology is that it runs into a lot of problems you could probably guess. For starters, what if I could guess what a word means based on the parts that make it up? If I know that words starting with the prefix anti refer to the opposition to the stem, and I already know the word establishment, and I see the word anti-establishment for the first time in my life, I can almost certainly figure out what it means. So do I know what the word means? Can I know what a word means if I've never seen it before? Next, what about defining words that have multiple meanings? How many parts of a word's definition do I need to be able to provide before I can be said to know what that word actually means? If I know 7 out of the 2.68 million definitions of a word like get or run, do I know it? Or do I need a preponderance of the definitions and to know them beyond a reasonable doubt? The jury's still out on that one. What if I only know how to use the word but not how to perfectly define it? You might suggest that this probably isn't the case for most words, and you'd be right. It's only really the case for the common words. Like, what does like mean? I don't mean the verb to like, I mean the usage in that previous sentence. It's a fairly flexible word and it has a lot of functions, but those functions aren't exactly easy to define. If you want to try a little game to see just how far this goes, please, in the comments, tell me what the preposition to means. I think we'd all agree that just because you're almost certainly struggling to define to in its entirety doesn't mean you don't know the word, right? So, do we feel that knowing how to use a word in context counts as knowing it? Because if we allow people to count as knowing a word because they know how to correctly use words like if, to, and like in context, do we allow people who know how to use more obscure words in context? Until the writing of the script, I wasn't fully sure what preponderance meant. But I did use it correctly in this script, so did I know? And those are all the issues that exist even if we have the objective wordometer, patent pending. If we don't have one for some reason, like, oh, I don't know, it doesn't and couldn't ever exist, then things get even worse. Obviously, there's still the question of knowing what a word is and how much of a word's definition you might need to know, but what about weirdly obscure words? The thing about dictionaries is that they aren't perfect and could never hope to be. Slang, technical jargon, regionalisms, and so many other things regularly don't make it into dictionaries. I regularly find myself surrounded by weirdos on the internet, usually of the anime or furry variety, so I often encounter words like oh whoa and ooh woo. And while they definitely have meanings and use cases and pronunciations, you won't find them in Webster's or the OED, but dictionaries regularly count prefixes among their ranks, which means that while you might not find oh whoa, you will find ovo. The reason this is relevant is that there are far more obscure words than some slang thrown around by weebs and furries. And if they don't make it into the actual unabridged dictionaries which aim to track all of the known words in a language, how can we, as mere researchers, hope to know if we're not missing some large quantity of words? There's bound to be at least a few words which are known by only a few people from Hicksville, Arkansas, or a select group of academics researching something stupid, or the fans of an unpopular show. These could count as words, and could add up to a not insignificant number, but we would miss them nonetheless. I'd like to call back to the problem of what that scratchy, hairy fastener is, because of something called trademark nullification. Velcro, the company, insists that it's called hook and loop, and would very much appreciate if you called it that. But most people, myself included, just call it Velcro. Some companies will go so far as to threaten to sue Dictionaries to make sure that their trademark is protected, which means that according to Webster's, you can only Google things on Google's search engine, and you can only Photoshop things in Photoshop. Never mind the fact that alternatives to these products do exist, and you can't really tell if someone photoshopped something in Photoshop or Googled it in Google. So this calls back to our previous question of how much of a definition I need to know in order to know a word. Not all dictionaries will necessarily have the same meaning for all words, and what happens if I think I can Google something on any search engine? Do I know what the word means? Dictionaries are, honestly, a whole nexus of problems for us, because they are always going to be imperfect. But while we're on the topic of products and words, and if products are words, if we allow words not listed in the dictionary to count, how many people need to know a word for it to count? We've already seen that products can exist in a bizarre middle ground for words, but let's assume that we could count products. What if we start a competitor to Velcro brand Hook and Loop and name it Zgorps? Have I just invented a word? Do I actually need to make a product? Does it need to be on shelves? What if I never actually make it? Everyone watching this video should still know what I mean if I told them to use Zgorps to adhere something to a wall. So, have I just invented a word by means of a hypothetical? Does that mean I know infinite hypothetical words? Probably not. Right? So, given all of that, I think we should address the German-speaking elephant in the room. Because other languages are really where this already insanely difficult task becomes functionally impossible. You see, and I know this might come as a shock, but other languages exist. And some people even speak them. Hell, some people even speak multiple languages. Up until now, we've mostly been asking what counts as a word and what it means to know a word. But linguists have historically struggled with a third question. What counts as a discrete language? Trust me when I say this, we do not have a good answer. There are all kinds of crazy situations that really push the boundary of what counts as a language. And I'd love to get into them, but this video is already longer than I'm going to want to record and animate, so I'll save that for a different day. But let's continue. We've already seen how some German verbs are able to exist in the boundary between one word or two, and we'll get back to that, but most people know at least a word or two in another language. Maybe it's just the word for hello, or a simple phrase you remember from your high school Spanish class, but you do know some words in other languages, and I'm unsure if we should count those as words people know. If I were to say, hola, ¿cómo estás to you, without any context, chances are, even if you don't consider yourself a Spanish speaker, as long as you know at least a little bit of Spanish, you probably understood me. Was I speaking in Spanish? Yes. Did you understand me? Probably also yes. So do those count as words you know? Maybe. You might insist that we only count native words to a language, but loanwords and calques exist and complicate things quite a bit. What exactly counts as a native word to a specific language? It's very likely that Bush never actually said that the problem with the French was that they don't have a word for entrepreneur. However, English speakers certainly didn't until we stole it from the French. But these days, the concept of the entrepreneur is so intertwined with the American identity that it would be hard to say that it isn't a word in English. So when does a loanword become a native word in a language? People really like using words from other languages as a way of showing off or marking membership in one group or another. So we have a lot of words that just float around and complicate the question. Not just as to what counts as a word, but what even counts as English to begin with. If we assume that knowing a word in another language adds to your vocabulary, do bilingual people know double the words? Does my constructed language add words to my vocabulary? There are certainly words in it which don't map neatly onto English concepts. If my conlang doesn't, does Spanish? If synonyms, which don't exist, count as different words, surely manzana should count as a separate word from apple. Beyond just what words I know, what even counts as a word in a different language will likely be different. A proper dictionary entry in Latin lists not one word per verb, but 4. This is because in Latin, knowing how a verb conjugates is important to properly identifying the verb. So 4 different verb forms need to be listed. And Latin nouns require 2 forms, the nominative singular and the genitive singular, to be able to actually identify them. So if you thought that separate verb or noun forms counted as different words, other languages might disagree. Some languages take this whole process to an entirely different level. Highly agglutinative languages, which have lots and lots of affixes, tend to forego defining or even listing words and instead focus on listing the affixes themselves, since it wouldn't be useful to define all of the, no joke, millions of potential words that each affix could be used in. These languages can also have very large words, oftentimes encompassing whole sentences worth of meaning in other languages. So how many words does a speaker of one of those languages know? Is it even useful to ask that question? What about languages with agreement between words? You probably already know that in languages like Spanish and German, what article or adjectival form you use is dependent on the gender and number of the noun. In a way, the noun is affecting words at a distance, and is doing something similar to German prepositional verbs. Separate words display a connection between themselves, which I think makes the boundary between them a bit fuzzy. If you think about it, we even see this to an extent with English. Consider how we say a dog, but an apple. So, where does that leave us? Our original question has fallen apart. Words don't exist, knowledge is at best ephemeral, and our favorite LingTubers are wasting their time talking about conlangs rather than writing new Cultist Simulator video scripts. It's not a fun place to be, but I think I have a question that will resolve this issue for us. Why do you care how many words you know? Many of you probably clicked on this video intending to learn something out of general curiosity. But some of you probably do want to know how many words you actually know. If you're trying to figure that out because you think you know more words than most people or are worried that you know fewer words than most, I strongly advise that you give up on that idea. A lot of people think that knowing big words is a sign of intelligence. I can confirm this is not true. The true sign of intelligence is the ability to communicate your thoughts, feelings, desires, and motivations to the people you care about. Knowing what pseudo-autocheiria is has never done that for me, and will never do that for you. Knowing big, fancy words is a waste of energy, and unless you're like me and find obscure words cool or entertaining, it's a waste of your valuable time that you could be spending doing something more important. And if you are like me, and you find words cool or entertaining, then you shouldn't worry about how many words you know, because knowing that won't teach you any more words. It'll only distract you from what's really important in this world: commenting on my videos.